Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. My name is Manmeet. I also go by Sahiba. I use they, them pronouns, and I will be serving as the MC and moderator for today's teach-in. Thank you all for making time on this Sunday to be here for this teach-in, and welcome to today's event, Queering the Revolution, Sikh and Palestine Solidarity Teach-in. We gather here today amidst the settler Zionist state of Israel continuing its genocidal project without any delay after the end of the quote-unquote pause, with the heavy bombing and airstrikes across Gaza resuming with full impunity. We gather here today with the US government continuing to further domestic repression and censorship as it passes legislations criminalizing expressing solidarity and support with Palestine. We gather here today in the midst of the announcement just this week of the US government pressing charges against a man plotting the murder of Gurmat Singh Pannu, further confirming what we've already known about the Indian government's explicit purpose to assassinate and eradicate Sikh leadership in the diaspora. We gather here today as the Indian government continues strategizing to suppress Sikh sovereignty and further bolster its genocidal projects that are not just limited to Sikhs, but also include hundreds of millions of Muslims who are facing continuous threats of ongoing violence as Modi and the Hindu right government uses Israel's genocidal violence and anti-Palestinian and Islamophobic rhetoric to further intensify its commitment to creating a Hindu ethno-nationalist state. We gather here today as the Modi regime continues furthering the concentration camps in occupied Assam and further escalates military assaults and repression in occupied Kashmir. We gather here today within just a few days of Pranshu Yadav's death by suicide, who was a 16-year-old queer child harassed and bullied online for their queerness and pushed to the point of suicide. We gather here today as Israel continues justifying its genocide through pinkwashing its occupation as a liberatory project for queer and trans people. We gather here today in the midst of growing anti-LGBTQIA+ sentiments and legislations across the settler states of Canada and the United States. We gather here today in the midst of Sikhs becoming instruments of the empires in these projects. We gather here today in the midst of multiple occupations and all of these multiple violences that are not being waged in isolation. We gather here today oriented by a commitment to realizing Badshahi or divine sovereignty in this world where divinity and sovereignty are under attack. I'm really honored to welcome you all to this teach-in titled Queering the Revolution, Sikh and Palestine Solidarity Teach-in, dedicated to foregrounding solidarities that are politically queer and world-making in their commitment to ending all occupations and oppressive regimes built on and sustained through death, cruelty, and structures of violence. I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to especially thank the co-sponsors and the supporters of this teach-in that include Halimi Leher, Sikhs for Palestine, Poetic Justice Foundation, Jakarta Movement, Sikh LGBTQIA+ Oral History Project, National Sikh Youth Federation, Sikh Socialists, Sikh Displacement Project, Paronte and Politics, Black X Sikh, Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice, the Center for India and South Asia Research, CSAR, and UBC Middle East Studies at the University of British Columbia, the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies at Simon Fraser University, SFU, the Ethnic Studies Department at UC San Diego, and Sikh Studies at UC Irvine. Throughout this teach-in, we will be sharing and uplifting the various efforts of solidarity through the chat to continue providing you with different opportunities to be able to plug in with the various work that is happening across our partners. And lastly, we want to share the link in the chat, which is going to be used for folks to be able to send us different questions that we'll do our very best to be able to kind of create space for in the duration of our teach-in. So with that said, we want to open up the teach-in with an Ardas, for which I am very honored to invite Jasmine to lead the Ardas. Jasmine has been a community organizer, and we will drop their link in the chat as well. But Jasmine, if I can, thank you. I will pin you as well, and pass it over to you.
All right, lovely. Thank you. Thank you for the intro. Yes, my name is Jasmine. I live on Dakota and Anishinaabe land in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm here to do Ardas for the first time publicly. So please be gentle with me with a little bit of my broken Gurmukhi. If you are able to cover your head, please do. Yeah, I will begin. Ardas ਇੱਕ ਓਂਕਾਰ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਭਗਵਤੀ ਜੀ ਸਹਾਇ ਵਾਰ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਭਗਵਤੀ ਜੀ ਪਾਤਸ਼ਾਹ ਦਸਵੀਂ ਪ੍ਰੀਤਮ ਭਗਵਤੀ ਸਿਮਰ ਕੇ ਗੁਰੂ ਨਾਨਕ ਜੀ ਲੈ ਤਿਹਾਏ ਫਿਰ ਗੁਰੂ ਅੰਗਦ ਤੇ ਗੁਰੂ ਅਮਰਦਾਸ ਰਾਮਦਾਸ ਹੋਏ ਸਹਾਇ ਗੁਰੂ ਅਰਜਨ ਗੁਰੂ ਹਰਗੋਬਿੰਦ ਨੂੰ ਸਿਮਰ ਸਿਰ ਹਰ ਰਾਏ Shri Har Krishan Tihai Jis Dithe Sab Dukh Jaye Gur Tegh Bahadur Simriye Garno Nid Ave Dae Sab Thae Hona Ji Sahai Dasme Patsha Shri Guru Gobind Singh Sahib Ji Sab Thae Hoye Sahai Dase Patsha Di Jot Shri Guru Granth Sahib Ji De Pat Bani Ji ਧਿਆਨ ਧਰਕੇ ਬੋਲੋ ਜੀ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ
ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ
ਪੰਜਾਂ ਪਿਆਰਿਆਂ ਚੌਹੇ ਸਾਹਿਬਜ਼ਾਦਿਆਂ ਚਾਲੀਆਂ ਮੁਕਤੀਆਂ ਹੁੱਟੀਆਂ ਜਪੀਆਂ ਤੁਪੀਆਂ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨਾਮ ਜਪਿਆ ਵੰਡ ਕੀ ਸ਼ਿਕਾਇਆ ਦੇਗ ਚਲੇ ਦੇਗ ਵਾਹੇ ਦੇਖ ਕੀ ਅੰਡਿਤ ਕੀਤਾ ਤਿੰਨਾਂ ਪਿਆਰਿਆਂ ਸੱਚਿਆਰਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਕਮਾਈ ਦਾ ਧਿਆਨ ਧਰਕੇ ਬੋਲੋ ਜੀ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਵੰਡ ਕਟਾਏ ਖੋਪੜੀਆਂ ਲੁਹਾਏ ਚੱਕਰੀਆਂ ਤੇ ਚੱਡੇ ਅੱਕਾ ਨਾਲ ਚਰਾਏ ਗਏ ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰਿਆਂ ਦੀ ਸੇਵਾ ਲਈ ਕੁਰਬਾਨੀਆਂ ਕੀਤੀਆਂ ਧਰਮ ਨੀ ਹਰਾਏ ਸਿੱਖੀ ਕੇਸਾਂ ਸਵਾਸਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਨਿਭਾਏ ਦਿਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਕਮਾਈ ਦਾ ਧਿਆਨ ਧਰਕੇ ਬੋਲੋ ਜੀ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਪੰਜਾਂ ਤਖਤਾਂ ਸਰਬਤ ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰਿਆਂ ਦਾ ਧਿਆਨ ਧਰਕੇ ਬੋਲੋ ਜੀ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਪ੍ਰਿਤ ਮੈਂ ਸਰਬਤ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਅਰਦਾਸ ਹੈ ਜੀ ਸਰਬਤ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ 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 ਚਿਤਾਵੇ ਕਾ ਸਦਕਾ ਸਰਬ ਸੁਖ ਹਵਾਏ ਜਹਾਂ ਜਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਜੀ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਤਹਾਂ ਤਾਂ ਰਚਿਆ ਰਿਆਏ ਤੇਗ ਤੇਗ ਫਤਿਹ ਬਿਰਤ ਕੀ ਪੈਜ ਪੰਥ ਕੀ ਜੀਤ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਜੀ ਸਹਾਇ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਜੀ ਕੋ ਬੋਲ ਬਾਲੇ ਬੋਲੋ ਜੀ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਿੱਖੀ ਦਾਨ ਕੇਸ਼ ਦਾਨ ਰਹਿਤ ਦਾਨ ਵਿਵੇਕ ਦਾਨ ਵਿਸਾਦਾਨ ਭਰੋਸਾ ਦਾਨ ਦਾਨਾ ਸਰਦਾਨ ਨਾਮ ਦਾਨ Sri Amrit Sahib Ji ki darshan ishan, chonkiyan chande, bunge jugo jug atal, dharam ka jay karo, bolo ji, vaheguru. Sikhan da man niva, matuchi, mat taraka, aap vaheguru ji, hai akal purak, apna panth de sada sahai datar jio, Shri ਨਾਨਕਨਾ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਤੇ ਹੋਰ ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰਿਆਂ ਗੁਰਦਾਮਾਂ ਦੇ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਤੇ ਪੰਥ ਨੂੰ ਵਿਚੋੜਿਆ ਗਿਆ ਹੈ ਖੁੱਲੀਆਂ ਦਰਸ਼ਨ ਦੀਦਾਰ ਤੇ ਸੇਵਾ ਸੰਭਾਲ ਦਾ ਦਾਨ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਜੀ ਨੂੰ ਬਖਸ਼ੋ ਜੀ ਹੈ ਨਿਮਾਣਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਮਾਨ ਨਿਤਾਣਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਤਾਨ ਨਿਓਟਿਆਂ ਦੀ ਓਟ ਸੱਚੇ ਪਾਤਸ਼ਾਹ ਜੀ ਹੈ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਆਪ ਤੇ ਆਗੇ ਅਰਦਾਸ ਬੇਨਤੀ ਹੈ ਜੀ And then I'm going to do this part in English. Please guide us with fortitude as we build to a free and liberated Palestine, Congo, Kashmir, Tigray, Sudan, Turtle Island, and all occupied colonized lands. Please offer your grace over every Shaheed, named and unnamed, buried and unburied, every child, parent, friend, relative, lover of their land that has now become an ancestor. Please move us to self-determination for all queer and trans folks across all lands. May we free all political prisoners and tear down every punitive regime. Please protect Hisham, Kinan, and Tashin in Vermont as they heal from their injuries after lovingly wearing their kufiya. Protect those targeted by imperial powers for believing in liberation, and guide those causing harm to heal from their wounds and cravings for dominance. Thank you for being the light that we move towards in our radiating and unwavering commitment to liberation. From Punjab to Palestine, we will be free. Sab de karaj ras karne, sab sai pyare milo, jina miliya tera naam chitave, nanak naam, chaddi kala, tere pane, sarbat te pala. Vaheguru Ji ki Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji ki Fateh.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for starting us with Ardas so beautifully. With that, we want to move into our first presentation of today. Our first presentation for the teach-in will be led by Professor Amanda Batarse from the Palestinian Feminist Collective. Professor Batarse received her PhD in comparative literature from UC Davis and was a UC Chancellor's postdoctoral fellow at UC Riverside in the Department of Languages and Literature. I will drop her full bio into the chat, and throughout this chat teach-in, you are welcome to also send us questions. Again, we will drop the instructions to be able to send us questions in the chat as well. And with that, I will pass it over to Professor Batarse.
Everyone, thank you all for welcoming me within this space. I am so humbled to be here with you all. For the purposes of time, I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. I know we have a lot of amazing speakers today. So I'm primarily going to be trying to cover the context in which we find ourselves today, and also to provide us some historical context as well. So what is the situation right now? We are, we're swiftly approaching 2 months since Israel's bombing campaign in Gaza began on October 7th. In this latest barrage of aerial bombardments, the Israeli military has enforced new technologies of warfare onto the Palestinians in Gaza, resulting in a heinous attack on Palestinian life. The horrifying record is as follows. We currently have more than 15,000 Palestinians that have been killed. As of today, actually, I was quoted 20,000, and this is because there are still so many people whose bodies have not been recovered, still trapped underneath the rubble. More than 6,000 killed are children and 4,000 women. More than 40,000 injured, at least 70% of which are children and women. More than 6,000 missing. And of course, 62 journalists have been targeted, 55 of which were Palestinian, 4 Israeli, and up in the north, 3 Lebanese. In terms of thinking of this hour by hour, every hour in Gaza, and of course we know that the assault has recommenced in full force since this humanitarian pause. 42 bombs are dropped every hour, 12 buildings are destroyed, 15 people are killed, 6 of which are children, and 35 people are injured as we go on with our days. I still have more here. Also, it's important to know that Israel dropped 6,000 bombs in just the first 6 days of this assault, equivalent to 1/4 of a nuclear bomb. As of last week, this Israeli military has dropped 40,000 tons of explosives on Gaza since October 7th. For context, the first atomic bomb dropped on the United States in Hiroshima in 1945 was equivalent to roughly 12,000 tons of explosive power. So roughly 3 times that has fallen on Gaza over the past month and a half. Israel has also maintained its near constant siege, cutting off water, power, fuel, and supplies to Gaza in an act of collective human punishment. During this time, there has also been an increase in the violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, which was already at record heights before October 7th. So this is an extension of collective punishment in the West Bank as well. This collective punishment against the people of Gaza then has extended to and exacerbated the ongoing violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. Currently, at least one person is murdered by an Israeli settler in the West Bank each day. More than 254 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th, including 61 children. Two children, Adam Samar al-Bul, 8 years old, and Bassa Sulman Abul Wafa, 15 years old, were killed by Israeli soldiers while playing soccer in the city of Jenin just last week. Palestinian detainees in Israeli prisons are being tortured and harassed in their cells by military personnel, and massive arrests are happening all over the West Bank without due process. Since October 7th, over 3,000 people in the West Bank have been arrested, including women and children. And it's also important to note that this also includes gendered and sexual violence, whether in threat of rape or actual assault within these conditions of imprisonment. Palestinian homes are being continuously raided at night, and these assaults are also increasingly militarized. So, for example, a lot of our focus, as it should be, has been on the bombings in Gaza, but this bombing isn't just focused in on Gaza. In late October, a mosque in the Jenin refugee camp was targeted by the Israeli military. Since the start of the war in Gaza, at least 16 communities have been depopulated, meaning that more than 900 Palestinians across the West Bank have been displaced. As this shows, this is not simply a retaliation against Hamas, but an active collective punishment of all Palestinians within and outside of Gaza. For those in Gaza suffering this genocidal attack, they are trapped and targeted deliberately, as opposed to what is casually being thrown around as casualties of war. And then just to explain, the map on the right just helps you contextualize the spatial difference. So Gaza, for those of you who are not very familiar with the geography, is on the west coast border of the Mediterranean Sea, while the West Bank is more inland. And the reason this map is useful is it shows you that all of those spaces in the West Bank in white and all of those purple dots and squares are territories not only inaccessible to Palestinians, but evidence of the ongoing expansion of those territories and the ways in which Palestinian lands are systematically and strategically surrounded by Israeli settlements. This attack on Gaza evidences the intent to make Gaza unlivable for its civilian population. That is, it is a targeting not of a specific political or militant group in Gaza, but of the entire population. And this is performed not only through an attack on Palestinian life, but on that which makes life possible. So specifically the Gazan infrastructure. Over half of Gaza's homes, that's 278,000 residents, have been destroyed and damaged. 311 educational facilities have been damaged. 26 of the 35 hospitals in Gaza are now non-functioning. 87 ambulances have been targeted, and 167 places of worship, that is both mosques and churches, have been damaged. So we need to take the comments that are coming out of the Israeli military seriously. This is from the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on October 10th. They, the Palestinians, will regret this moment. Gaza will never go back to what it was. So the violence against Gaza since October 7th has to be situated within the larger understanding of the Israeli siege on Gaza that has been ongoing for 17 years. So what is this siege? Gaza is home to 2.3 million people living in a place that is the size of Detroit. So for context, Detroit has a population of 500,000, and it is already considered an overcrowded city. For the past 17 years, Gaza has been under siege, meaning Israel controls everything coming in and out of Gaza by air, land, and sea. As a result, Gaza relies primarily on international aid for basic goods such as food, water, medical supplies, and other necessities. And it goes without saying that this siege doesn't control the movement of goods and supplies, but of human bodies. Gazans are trapped within these borders. So Gaza is described as the world's largest open-air prison, even though recently I heard even a critique of that, because prisons ostensibly, and we can talk about abolition in another place, are ostensibly a place where people who are guilty are contained. But obviously, if you look at this in context of children are not themselves guilty of anything. So it is, I think, a more apt description of Gaza would actually be a concentration camp. So, but it is described as the world's largest open-air prison, not only because movement inside and outside is entirely restricted, but because the living conditions are severely regulated and penalized. The United Nations has repeatedly described Gaza's living conditions over the past 17 years as a humanitarian crisis. So what does this mean? For instance, Palestinians are not allowed to go to the West Bank to seek medical attention or to visit family. There are people who've been separated from family members across this border for 17 years. They must apply for permits for this, which Israel routinely denies sick patients, meaning that a severe medical condition or illness such as cancer generally just becomes a death sentence. 56% of Palestinians in Gaza suffer from poverty. 75% of the population suffers from food insecurity. Israel has imposed, and again, all of these numbers are from before October 7th. Israel has imposed a food policy limiting Gazan calorie intake by controlling their imports. Gazans have tried to rely on traditional fishing economy, for instance, for sustenance, but are limited by the siege to 3 nautical miles off the coast, which severely restricts any ability to catch food. And if they attempt to access deeper waters farther out, they are shot at by Israeli naval patrols. Also, in the attempt to kind of create some kind of food sovereignty, this has also made impossible or at least severely challenged in terms of farming. And this is because 1/3 of Gaza's arable lands fall within the security border, meaning that those who attempt to enter their lands to farm also become targets of the military. The youth suffer an unemployment rate of 63%. And it's important to note here, as I will in a second, that this is a huge number, not only because it's 63% of the youth, but the majority of Gaza's population is under 18. So that means that employment rate in terms of the total population is actually going to be very high. 97% of water in Gaza was considered unsafe already before October 7th, which means that the water crisis in Gaza is already causing severe illness, not only because people are suffering from a total lack of water at this point, but also because they are drinking unsafe water. There has been no electricity in Gaza for over 50 days, and before October 7th, the electricity was limited to 4 hours a day and could be cut off at any time. So during the 1948 war, that established the state of Israel, and we'll talk about that in just a second, the Zionist militias bombed 29 villages in southern Palestine, leading tens of thousands of Palestinians to flee to the Gaza Strip. As a result, over 75% of Palestinians living in Gaza today are refugees. So this is a refugee population. And again, as we'll discuss in a second, who are therefore suffering from potential displacement again. As a result of this siege, Gaza has been susceptible to repeated cases of genocidal violence. The most recent onslaught, this past month and a half, dubbed Operation Sword of Iron by Israel, has been the most deadly and destructive. However, this is Gaza's 6th major war in 16 years. Put alternately, a 16-year-old in Gaza has survived 5 wars and doesn't know if they will survive this one. The reason, as I noted, that the average age in Gaza is young, under 18 years old, is due to these repeated military assaults. And this is, of course, why we're seeing the casualty rate, the death rate for civilians, compromising so many children. In every major war since 2008, Israel has tested and deployed new weapons and artillery on Gaza. For instance, Israel deployed white phosphorus against Palestinians in 2009 and have used it again in this assault. Even just breathing the smoke can cause respiratory damage, damage to internal organs, and fetal defects, and the use of white phosphorus is illegal under international law. So how can we contextualize the struggle within the history of Palestine over the past 75 years? The most recent attack on Gaza did not begin with the Hamas operation on October 7th, but as Palestinians have testified for decades, the root cause of this cycle of violence, as it has been called, is Zionist settler colonial violence. For Palestinians, refer to this as the ongoing Nakba, or ongoing catastrophe. A Nakba refers to the historical event of Palestinian expulsion from their homeland over 75 years ago, and has continued through settler colonial expansion, racialized apartheid, and militarized violence ever since. In 1948, Zionist militias destroyed more than 500 villages, expelled 750,000 Palestinians from their homes, so that's approximately 80% of the indigenous Palestinian population at the time, and killed 15,000 Palestinians in a series of mass atrocities and massacres. This was not just the expulsion of a people, a quote-unquote ethnic cleansing, but an attempt to annihilate the entirety of the Palestinian population and civilization, that is, the land, history, and people of Palestine. Although the Nakba invasion began in 1948, it is an ongoing structure that shapes life for all Palestinians, the world's largest refugee population, wherever they are situated. I'm not going to go into detail on this history of displacement, but just a quick kind of visionary of how this displacement has impacted Palestinians, not just in the West Bank, but in Gaza, but across their places of exile. So as a stateless refugee population, Palestinians have endured a multiplicity of wars that have destroyed homes, resulting in secondary, tertiary, I don't know how to do it beyond that, second, third, fourth, fifth, and in some cases, 6 displacements since 1948. Therefore, as Palestinians, we understand the Nakba to be not only, as I said, a historical event that happened in 1948, but a structure of colonization that is ongoing and has continued ever since. A lens that helps us visualize this ongoing structure of Zionist settler colonialism, commonly associated with the shrinking map of Palestine that you may have seen, is a focus on the continuation of Zionist land expansion relative to the Oslo Accords, the famous negotiations of the 1990s. The 1993 Oslo Accords were 30 years ago, or started 30 years ago, and lasted until about 2000. During these so-called peace talks, the Palestinian Liberation Organization leadership traded in the principles of Palestinian anti-colonial struggle, that is decolonization, liberation, and return, for a hollow promise of statehood on just 22% of the land, surrendering not only 78% of Palestine in these proposed talks, but also the right of return for the millions of Palestinian refugees displaced outside of Palestine. The Oslo Accords therefore transformed an anti-colonial liberation movement into a state-building project, producing a para-state entity known as the Palestinian Authority, which has essentially become an arm of the occupation and is housed in the West Bank. This framework of liberal peace has served to further entrench Israeli settler colonial rule and expansion. During this period, from 1993 to 2000, so during this period of peace talks, quote unquote peace talks, Israel annexed more lands for settlement construction in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, and at a faster rate than any time between 1967 and 1993. So in other words, Israel annexed more land during the 7-year period of peace negotiations, when Palestinians were in fact relinquishing many of their decolonial demands, than during the 25-year period previous, when Palestinians had been actively engaging in the anti-colonial liberation movement. And this is really, really critical, because it demonstrates that no matter what Palestinians do, and also especially if they capitulate their decolonial demands, settler colonial expansion and Palestinian death not only continues, but it increases. Returning to the side-by-side images illustrating ongoing Nakba from 1948 to the present I referenced before, therefore, helps us comprehend this ongoing condition of settler colonialism. Although we cannot flatten the distinct history and present moment as though identical, especially because Palestine does not exist in the present moment as a cohesive landmass the way it did at the time of the Nakba, a comparison of 1948 to the present continues to expose the uninterrupted structure of Zionist settler colonialism from the past into the present. In October alone, 1.1 million Palestinians were compelled to flee from the north to the south of the Gaza Strip to seek refuge from Israeli bombs while being attacked along the way. They were bombed along the way in their attempt to get to safety, as they had been instructed by the Israeli military to move south. The images and videos that circulated social media revealed a haunting familiarity that many called Nakba 2023. In fact, this affirmation of a repeat Nakba is not only coming from Palestinians, but from Israeli officials themselves. So you will see the quote on the left from Israeli Knesset member Arya Kovner on October 8th of 2023, referring to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by Zionist militias as a historical event that needed to be continued. Quote, right now, one goal, Nakba, a Nakba that will overshadow the Nakba of 48, Nakba in Gaza, and Nakba to anyone who dares to join. And we can see in numbers that this has already happened. 15,000 people killed in 1948 by Zionist militias, and so far more than 15,000 people killed in Gaza since October 7th. A 10-page document dated October 13th, 2023 has actually surfaced, called Policy Paper Options for a Policy Regarding Gaza's Civilian Population, from Israel's intelligence ministry itself. It recommends expelling the Strip's population to Egypt, Sinai Desert, as the best way to secure Israel's long-term interests. Furthermore, the document calls upon Israel to seek international support for this proposed initiative. It is worth noting that the authenticity of this document has been officially confirmed by the Israeli intelligence ministry itself. And again, we can see this happening at the moment. If you look at the image on the right, you can see the evacuation lines that have been declared over the past month and a half as they move farther and farther south, pushing Gaza's population, 2.3 million people, towards ever closer towards the Rafah crossing, so that this future planned, hoped for expulsion of Palestinians outside of Gaza can be achieved. So how is it this has been able to go on for so long? Palestinian dehumanization, the rhetoric that sustains public life and political policy, both for Israel and its allies, particularly the United States, is fundamental to the project of ongoing settler colonialism. Palestinian resistance is often taken out of context, removed from the settler colonial past and present. Moreover, armed struggle is not the only form of resistance Palestinians have and continue to deploy in their fight to combat the settler colonial structural, physical, and physiological forms of violence they face daily. They have and continue to use every tool at their disposal to fight for their freedom, including through boycotts, pickets, strikes, protests, petitions, cultural products such as literature, film, and art, and appeals to the international community. However, when these forms of, quote, peaceful resistance are not ignored, they are criminalized and weaponized by Zionist rhetoric against Palestinians. Through all of this, the international community has granted Israel complete impunity. The US has vetoed every UN resolution protecting Palestinians as they seek to uphold international law. For the sake of time, I won't go into detail about these slides, but just as a recent example, the Israeli government has just in the past year categorized a number of Palestinian human rights groups as, quote, terrorist organizations. And these classifications have been adopted by the United States. So I'm just going to be wrapping up here. This all is made possible by a rhetoric of dehumanization, or we might call selective humanity, which refers to how language is used to establish difference, creating categories of the, quote, human and the, quote, non-human to justify structural and bodily violence against the latter. The language of selective humanity excludes Palestinians from a civilizational discourse that allocates intrinsic and immeasurable value to human life. This selective humanity has been pervasive not only in Israeli rhetoric, but also the recent media coverage and responses by the American and European governments to what's going on. So on the left, those two examples are the language of Palestinian dehumanization that we have been seeing in the media. In the middle there, again, we have Yoav Gallant, and also from the Prime Minister of Israel himself, framing this civilizational battle with those that are non-human or the children of darkness against the children of light. So an overarching civilizational discourse aimed at targeting all of Palestinian human life. And on the far right, we can see how this plays out in social media and in public discourse. Two screenshots that were shared at the beginning of the assault, one by Jamie Lee Curtis and the other by Justin Bieber, which of course these people may seem trivial, but they are part of this public discourse, condemning the violence against Israel by sharing images actually of destruction of Palestinian life in Gaza. And rather than, when they were corrected that these were actually images of Gaza, condemning that violence as well, they simply removed the images from their social media feeds. So this kind of civilizational framing indicates the way Orientalist anti-Muslim discourse shapes common knowledge about what's happening in Gaza now, specifically, and Palestine more broadly. The swiftness of media and the international community to believe unverified reports about Palestinian brutality resonates with the unverified claims in 2001 about the so-called axis of evil and Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, a rhetoric around which Americans rallied to enter the so-called war on terror. Some of the media reports out of the US, which perpetuate stereotypes about Palestinian brutality, have already been redacted because they were revealed to be unverified and entirely manufactured. So this selective humanity, pervasive in the media's language and framing of the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict as two-sided rather than a settler colonial struggle, has only fortified the genocidal structure of the Israeli regime and the international community's inaction. When the Israeli Defense Minister Gallant calls Palestinians in Gaza human animals, and American politicians like Nikki Haley echo and spread this rhetoric with public comments like "Finish them, Netanyahu," Palestinians pay with their lives. And lastly, we have seen this playing out not only, of course, in Gaza, but now on our own shores, the impact of this deadly rhetoric by our politicians and by our media platforms. We have seen this, we saw this early on in October when Joseph Kuzba, a 71-year-old, attacked Wadia Al-Fayoume, a 6-year-old boy who was renting, him and his mother were renters from this person. And he entered their home and attacked Wadia, stabbing him 26 times, and he died in hospital. And only a week ago, as was noted at the opening of our talk, 3 Palestinian students, Hisham Awarthani, Kenan Abdelhamid, and Tahsin Ahmed, were shot near a university campus in Vermont by Jason Eaton. They were approached and shot by the assailant as they were conversing in Arabic and wearing the kafiyas. They survived, but Hisham has lost all use of his legs and will likely, according to his doctors, not walk again. So I'm going to wrap up on that very disturbing note, but I will go ahead and drop some links in the chat so that I don't leave you feeling in total despair, that can help you think about how to mobilize around advocating for Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for such a thorough and such a brilliant presentation as well, like covering and giving us so much historical grounding and context as well. Thank you for that. For the sake of time, we'll just, if it's okay, ask one question, and then before we move to the next presentation. And again, as a reminder to folks in the audience, the information or in terms of how to submit Q&A for the duration of this entire teaching is in the chat as well as more information about how to support the Palestinian Feminist Collective has also been dropped into the chat. But a question that we had is, you spoke a lot about the power of language and dehumanization and the liberal framework of peace that the occupations also maintaining. Can you talk a little bit more about how pinkwashing has been created also by the, especially as another arm of the occupation and furthering this image in the global scene, particularly the West, to obscure the genocidal violence of
Absolutely. So one thing that we're seeing, kind of a Zionist refrain that we're seeing appearing as a justification for Gazan dehumanization is, well, if you were gay, they would kill you, right? First of all, the triteness of this is just absolutely offensive. But yes, as we have seen in Israel, pinkwashing or kind of the manipulation of the LGBTQ movement for liberation as a tool of silencing Palestinian resistance by claiming that LGBTQ violence is somehow, in a way, making it as though this is somehow unique to Palestine, as though all places in the world are not struggling for LGBTQ liberation. So it's become a very, I think it started out maybe as a more effective tool than it is now, because people have become much more informed about kind of the flimsiness of this kind of sweeping argument. But I actually saw a very interesting video. If I can find it, I will drop it in the chat later. But it was by a group of organizers who actually, and who are predominantly queer, who entered Gaza. I don't know if it was part of a flotilla or just a delegation, but somehow were able to enter and were providing aid. And the argument made there was like, Palestinians are much more concerned with issues of human liberation than random acts of violence against people who have come to help them. And that this broad brush of stating that, well, if you were gay in Gaza, you would be dead, they would kill you. One is just such an offensive trope and reduction of the struggle that queer folks face, not only in Palestine but across the globe, but is also blatantly untrue, as evidenced by this experience of this group. And the comment that this individual made was that it's not an argument of whether or not queer folks face violence in Palestinian communities. It's a question that queer folks face violence everywhere. And that patriarchy not only is not unique to Palestine, but it is actually a tool of settler colonialism. So we have seen, for example, as I noted, for this mass arrest campaign that's going on in the West Bank right now, and the number of videos for instance, there were workers in Gaza who were trapped within Israel because they had permits to work there, and when the war started they couldn't get back, were bound up and subjected to like gendered forms of torture, stripping them down, other things that I don't really want to repeat here because it's too upsetting. But these tactics of using gender and sexuality as a tool of settler colonial violence are just rampant. Again, the prisoner release, really we should call it a hostage exchange, because those who were released were women and children and were hostages of the Israeli military in this most recent exchange, recounted not only an increase in violence and torture over the past month and a half that was already ongoing for Palestinians who have been subject to this for decades, but increased threats of sexual violence and rape, especially against women, and again also against men. So yeah, I hope that kind of, I'm sorry, I went a little bit all over the place, but I think more and more we're seeing more nuance in this history of using gender and sexuality as a tool of dehumanizing Palestinians writ large in Orientalist anti-Muslim discourse.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. Thank you. And just a quick question that also just came in as well, kind of pulling a little bit more on especially the disinformation that is being spread. Folks were just asking for any reputable sources that you would recommend for accurate and fact-based reporting. So if there were any kind of resources when it comes to being able to access more accurate information.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me go ahead and drop those in the link. And also, this is I don't know if I should say this yet because it's not finalized yet, but within the PFC we are working on a resource that's going to more directly address gender and sexual violence as a tool of Zionist settler colonialism. And recently a campaign that we have started is Shut Down Zionist Feminism. So I will also drop us in the chat, even though we're currently working on those resources. But yes, absolutely happy to do that.
No, thank you so much for that. And thank you again for all your time, for all your brilliance.
My pleasure.
With that, we will move to the next presentation, especially having established a really important historical foundation. So